let's jump into today's seminar, which is going to focus on how science fiction, especially how dystopian or utopian portrayals of technological futures, percolate in current discussions of AI technologies. I'm really excited to welcome today's panelists for what I'm sure is going to be a really illuminating conversation. And I'll take the moment now to introduce them. We have Chen Jing, who's an associate professor at the School of Arts at Nanjing University and a founding member of the Innovation Center for Digital Humanities Research at the Institute of Advanced Studies of Social Science and Humanities at Nanjing University. CJ's current interest focuses on digital art and digital humanities, especially visual knowledge production with digital technology. She has published essays in English and Chinese and curated exhibitions of painting, VR artworks, and generative art. Ada Hoffman is the author of the Outside Space Opera trilogy, as well as dozens of speculative short stories and poems. Ada's work has been a finalist for the Philip K. Dick Award, the Compton Crook Award, and the WSFA Small Press Award, among others. Ada is an adjunct professor of computer science and lives in Eastern Ontario. Alfred Haag is a cultural historian of technology, especially its role in the concept of human enhancement. He has published and given talks on topics including transhumanism, eugenics, cryonics, artificial intelligence, as well as their cultural representations. He has worked as a postdoctoral researcher at Birkbeck and as a visiting lecturer at the Royal College of Art, and he's recently completed an MSc in data science. Anna McFarlane is a lecturer in medical humanities at the University of Leeds, and a visiting collaborator on the Wellcome Trust-funded Future of Human Reproduction project at the University of Lancaster. She is the editor of the Edinburgh Companion to Science Fiction and the Medical Humanities and the Rutledge Companion to Cyberpunk Cultures.
Thank you so much.
She is the author of Seeing Through the Mirror Shades, Cyberpunk Culture and Psychology, and series editor for Palgrave's SFS, A New Canon. Welcome all. We're really excited to have you and to have today's conversation. So I think maybe the best place to start is thinking a little bit broadly about how science fiction narratives are or are not helpful for thinking about the current possibilities of AI. I know you all touch on this in sort of various aspects of your work, so I'm interested in maybe that as an opening thought. And we'll start with Anna, and particularly you've sort of framed this in some of your work, that some representations of technological futures like the neon data spaces of Tron and Neuromancer, or the world as illusion in the Matrix, leaves us ill-prepared to think about the consequences of things like black box algorithms, which are defined by our sort of inability to see inside. I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate a little bit on how you think that disconnect impacts our thinking about AI.
Yes, absolutely, Michael, and thank you for the introduction as well. Well, as Michael's just said, you know, I've done a decent amount of work on cyberpunk. I've edited the Routledge Companion to Cyberpunk Culture. I've published a book on William Gibson, Cyberpunk Culture and Psychology. And I do think cyberpunk is a really important way to think about how we envisage the internet, how we envisage AI, and just how we kind of understand our kind of technological society. You know, like cyberpunk began as a type of science fiction literature that came out in the 1980s, so it's most widely known for William Gibson's novels and his influence on films like The Matrix, as you say, and William Gibson coins the term cyberspace. So I think that it's a really important thing for thinking about how understanding of the internet and its place in our life has been shaped. Not only coining terms like cyberspace, but thinking about how data moves, how data becomes increasingly important in a globalized society, how maybe the nation state becomes less important. So yes, I do think cyberpunk is very important, just to be clear, to start out before I start criticizing it. So it's definitely shaped what we think about the internet. And one of the ways it's done this is through really visualizing. It's a really visual medium, even when it's in literary form. So when William Gibson's writing about the internet, he'll talk about like the neon data spaces, these kind of spaces behind the computer screen. So he's imagining the world of the internet as spatial rather than like a series of circuits or things like this. He's trying to give us like a visual way of seeing it so that we can in our minds walk through it, or I kind of fly through it. Like it's a very fast place. Obviously, data is moving really quickly all the time. So in his novels, the people that go into the matrix or cyberspace, they're flying through these neon streets. Data and corporations are represented as kind of neon buildings all around the place. And it's a really exciting space. And it really does give you a kind of grasp of the way that there are like different places that might spring up in the internet. People might kind of colonize various areas. Information is there and you can travel through it. And that's something that we still do think about the internet spatially, I suppose, in certain senses. Like, you know, people talk about falling down a Wikipedia rabbit hole and that kind of thing. There's a spatialization to the way we move through the data that is definitely represented in these texts. And then also on film, a film like Tron, which is quite retro now, and I don't know how many people in the webinar will have seen it, but they also use kind of neon racing, kind of these, I can't remember what they call it, glow cycles or something like that. These like glowing neon bikes, motorbikes that they'll race around on these neon racetracks. And again, representing kind of the like gaming and the way that you can move spatially through these kind of, internet spaces. I was trying to think of an example from more recently as well that kind of maybe could help people visualize what I'm talking about. And something that came to mind was maybe Ready Player One. It's a film that's set kind of in a game, but the characters are like moving around as though in reality. So like it's kind of like a way of mirroring this data space and showing it in a way that we can understand. So that's all been quite helpful in some ways. Definitely, again, helps us to understand the internet in a way. It makes it more accessible for people. It helps us to think more about how we relate to it. So there's that side of it that's helpful. And these texts are often quite critical of corporations and things like that, and the way that they take over space. They kind of colonize the space of the internet. So that's something that is quite helpful too. One of the things that I've been more critical of is that I don't think that this kind of visualization of neon space is particularly helpful for when things become more abstract. So in a kind of a situation like the black box algorithm, and by that, you know, that for anyone that doesn't know, that basically just means like a computer that's running algorithms, and it can take the output of its own. This is terrible. Humanities person describing this is going to be so bad. Sorry to anyone that really knows their stuff on this, but basically they can produce their own algorithms that then feed back into that algorithm. It's kind of like the computer is almost making its own tools, and there's no need for direct human intervention in every step that's being made here. So we can't, this isn't really a system. And, you know, even the term black box algorithm, it's kind of trying to describe to us that we can't look inside. We can't see exactly what's happening. We can't have agency over every single thing that this computer program is performing. So is the visualization that cyberspace has encouraged and has been useful to some extent, is that really a great way for us to approach an idea like the black box algorithm? And there's a really good collection by Oxford University Press called AI Narratives. I've got a chapter in there where I discuss it if people want to look into it further. But that's, I suppose that's my kind of concern, is that science fiction in some ways it is too spectacular, it's too visual, and sometimes this distracts us maybe from thinking about more abstract concepts that might not work on that visual level.
Thank you so much, Anna. I definitely think that idea that the metaphors operating in science fiction sometimes are helpful and sometimes aren't is a theme that's going to come up quite a lot today. I think maybe next to turn to CJ, again, thinking about how sometimes those metaphors are helpful and sometimes aren't. Some of your work has focused on the idea of the cyborg, which is this sort of anthropomorphized representation of technologies in science fiction. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the cyborg shaping our understanding of the sort of contemporary technological landscape.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Actually, it's a little bit shame for me to mention about the cyborg studies I have done like 10 years ago, almost 12 years ago. My background is digital humanities and digital art and digital heritage. So more and more, I realize actually it's quite important to think about what's a relationship between the human and the machine. That's why I started to do the cyborg studies a long time ago. And I think cyborg is a very powerful and useful word for us to describe such kind of relationship, because we don't have such kind of words until 1960. Two scientists actually coined this term to describe such kind of tensive relation between the human and the machine. And as a metaphor, I think the cyborg provides a good way to describe the relationship. And in the film and the literature, we already have seen so many, even too many figures or characters to represent the cyborg, what is cyborg. And also in the reality, I think as Andy Clark already mentioned many times a long time ago, we are cyborg already, because everyone's using machine, computer, cell phone, and every day. So we are part of the machine. And also we use the machine way to think about ourselves and to say the relationship with other people. But recently, because when I started to deal with data in the data analysis by myself, I realized cyborg or AI is not enough. So just like Anna shared the document, there is the title of the first chapter, it's Imagine AI. So I think a lot of the narratives is actually Imagine AI, because we don't know what is AI. Even we are talking about AI, but the AI, I mean, artificial intelligence became so blurry. And everyone talking about AI, just like Anna mentioned, it's like a black box. And so even we know it's computer, it's a machine, it's algorithm, it's code inside, but what is AI? How can we find out the intelligence? Can we talk to them? Just like we are talking to the human being. It's hard. And also sometimes we don't know what's inside, especially when I'm working with AI people and we start to use like GAN, also CNN, and to deal with image processing, text processing. I found out AI is very limited, or AI is just a part of the mechanism of the machine. And but we do have high expectation of AI about what AI can do for human being. But on another way, I want to say more and more we are trying to, like you mentioned about the shape. So I don't think we are shaping AI. It's more like on the other way, AI is shaping us. Because I learned what data thinking, from my works. I start to think about, documents, text, and images from the data way. Like I have to think about how can I collect the data from the image and the text, and then what can tool or algorithm it's better for me to analyze the text or image to provide the meaning for me to interpret for my research. That part is very interesting, but a little bit horry when I'm starting to think about what I'm doing, because for the humanities researcher, we always trying to use our own experiences and my knowledge to interpret what we can find out from our research process. But now sometimes I found out actually I'm giving up my power or my way to the machine to let them decide what kind of results is better for me to interpret. But that's also important because that's part of the world is becoming, and we have to accept and work with AI. But I wouldn't want to talk about AI only from the general way. I would like to talk about the detail, to concrete, part of the artificial intelligence, like what kind of codes or programming languages we are talking, and even what kind of way or part of the process we're talking about AI. But that part, I mean, from the narrative, from the literature, sometimes that part is locked because author or other people, they don't want to put too much energy to describe the detail. And also sometimes we want to promise something new, novel, fresh thing for the future, but it's too much. it's over, emphasized the role of the technology in the future, especially when we're talking about the ideological aspect of the application employment of AI. It's quite dangerous. As I mentioned in the email, because I'm dealing with the data, so I noticed the data is quite dangerous when we are talking about the bias. Racial or gender bias is everywhere in the images, like the case of the ImageNet. When we first started to annotate the images, they found a lot of, white men fingers to represent the working status. But that's horrible for people, because we are using those images to, like what I'm doing is to analyze, the images, trying to get out the result from this process. So my point want to say, cyborg at the end, it's more like we're talking about cyborg. Cyborg used to be really powerful, but cyborg is not enough because it's so general. So we have to think about what the kind of detail or even the sub-concepts under the cyborg that we can talk about, especially when we are talking about history. I think Harvard also mentioned something about a game, and Anna mentioned about a game. We used to think about a game, it's only about the imagination or the play, but I think a game also gave us another possibility to look back. But scientific, science fiction is good at imagining the future, but not that good at imagining the history. But that's also possible for us to think about what happened before, or what's the possibilities. That's why I started to do with heritage studies, because I'm thinking about, like 100 or 200 years later, when people study the history of now, what they can do, because they don't have the data for individual history like us. They only have the, the dead hardware or some information online in the dead archives or already disappearing archives. So what's the, history for the future people? And also, even in the future, when everyone became the part of the machine, we still necessary to think about what is cyborg. Like always say the digital humanities, it's about humanities. So when everything is digitized, there's no need for digital humanities existing, right? So it's the same way. So like for those moments, all the hybrid concepts are useful or helpful, but we have to think about what's happening in the next, 100 or 200 years later, what will happen there. So yeah, I think I'll just stop here, so that I would like to talk more maybe later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think particularly your comments about the challenge of sort of what do we actually mean when we're talking about AI and getting really specific is something that I think science fiction can sometimes be really helpful for, and at other points, as you alluded to, can actually make it more challenging. And in that spirit, I think I'd like to turn to Howard to maybe reflect a little bit about why that is. Why is it that when we're looking at reflections of AI in science fiction, we often aren't getting the kind of specificity we might want, but instead it seems like AI maybe is serving as a placeholder for other things? Maybe talk a little bit about the role you see AI playing as this kind of floating, unsettled signifier.
Sorry, I had myself muted there. Thank you. I wrote to you about this before, and this reflects something that I was working on a few years ago when I was doing research on the representations of AI in film and television. And like Anna was saying earlier, science fiction can often be a very visual medium, and especially, science fiction in film and television has this way of representing not just this notion of AI, but artificial beings often. But we get this particular way of looking at artificial intelligence as some kind of disembodied entity somehow. But you also have the flip side of that is, how do you represent an artificial being, the kind of robot or android, this kind of this entity that is man-made, so to speak. And there are, it takes on kind of different aspects of what themes are represented through these different approaches. So I kind of think of it in kind of broad categories. And I think they align to some degree with some of what the kind of general discourse around AI reflects today. So my first idea is that AI is often used as an allegory for something else, thematically speaking. And I have these kind of three general categories for allegorical representation. And the first is AI is used as an allegory or metaphor for labor relations. And that's kind of where the origin of our contemporary understanding of AI in terms of the robot originates. So the robot comes from this play, R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots from the 1920s, where the robot is a laborer. It's a synthetic person, essentially, which is made of material which is more durable than humans are. But they have more limited agency. And the word robot itself comes from this Slavic word for indentured servant or hard labor. So from the beginning of the usage of the word robot, it is about specifically about labor relations. So you have RUR, you have more contemporary depictions like Westworld, where these artificially intelligent robots, they are very much laborers and they have very limited agency in what they can do. But of course, there's the kind of robot rebellion, which is a trope in itself. So that's my first category of thinking about it, and this feeds into our idea now about AI upsetting, unemployment, labor relations, all that kind of stuff is things that are looming on the horizon. The second category I'm thinking about is more about conceptual relations, interpersonal relations, societal relations, about things like gender, race, and religion, where using especially these kind of robots, android, gynoid, all these kind of manifestations of artificial people, they embody specific social relationships of the moment. And I'm just going to borrow William Gibson, like Anna talked about earlier, because he often gets talked about how he's asked about how he's so good at predicting the future, and he always says, "I'm not predicting the future. I'm writing about the present." But it's the mode of writing about the present is through this kind of futuristic idiom. And so when you discuss gender relations or race relations or even religion in science fiction, you take these you take a robot and you make the collection of robots about being. It could be race relations. There's this kind of obscure film from the 60s called The Creation of the Humanoids, which really kind of drives home the point about the robots being like this separate race that get oppressed, and there's a clear parallel to the social relations in North America of that time. Or you have a film like Her. You could say that it's about gender relations, but it really satirizes that kind of romantic comedy genre as well. Or you have Battlestar Galactica, where the Cylons, there is some sort of religious underpinning to how they approach this. So that's my second category there, about metaphorical representation of these types of relations. It also feeds into this notion of bias that's very prominent in the discussion about AI presently. I think maybe Ada is speaking to bias later, so I won't go further into that. And then finally, this last category that I think about is about AI as an allegory for the large systems of control that we have in society. So they become personifications of things like government or like bureaucracy or even the surveillance society per se. So you have films like Alphaville, where this Alpha 60 computer is a manifestation and personification of the bureaucracy of running a city. Or you have there's this Star Trek episode from the 60s called can't remember what it's called. It's The Revenge of the Archons or something like that, where they arrive to this planet which is really well run, but it's kind of sterile, and they don't know what's going on, and they find out that there's a computer that's been running the society for hundreds of years, which is actually an uploaded mind from ages ago that's kind of maintains everything in a stasis. But my point being that this category where the AI is a representation of government itself, it gives a voice to government, but it also gives a voice to I guess poor government in some sense, because these systems, these personifications of systems, they are never benign, so to speak, except for maybe Ian Banks's Culture novel, something like that. But you know, this also speaks to this contemporary notion of existential risk, like AI poses a really strong risk. And why is that? Because AI is potentially really potent, somehow omnipotent. It has great agency. And what's the only real parallel to that kind of agency to be capable of destroying the world? It's governments. You know, the only real existential risks that we've faced as a clearly defined existential risk, I think, was nuclear war, probably in the Cold War. I mean, climate change poses a kind of existential risk now, but it's less clearly defined as an existential risk than nuclear war was at one point. And I think also nuclear war was when that idea of existential risk kind of first manifested. So yeah, those are my three kind of categories of allegorical or metaphorical representations I think of aliens. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Halvard. I think those categories are really useful for getting a little bit more specific about what we mean when we're talking about how AIs are represented. And I think your sort of reflections on existential risk is a really great transition to what I think Ada wants to talk a little bit more about. And I just in sort of framing that, you had this really nice way when we were talking before the seminar, where saying how AIs in fiction tend to sort of sinisterly, spontaneously decide to seek power or to interpret their program in unexpectedly literal ways, and that's what causes them to take over the world or otherwise sort of pose a risk to human society. But that in our current moment, that is nowhere near being the case, and it's actually humans who are using AI to cause harm. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about the sort of disconnect between perhaps those science fiction understandings of AI risk and our sort of contemporary challenges.
Right. So there are basically two major schools of thought right now in AI ethics. And one of them is the school of thought that's very concerned about existential risk. You know, the way Halvard was saying, people who are like, well, we want to design AIs in a certain way so that we can stop it from taking over the world. You know, and this is something some people in Silicon Valley actually take this very, very seriously. Like the entire kind of founding mission of OpenAI, for instance, is kind of to create an AI that will not pose an existential risk. And then meanwhile, you have this other school of thought in AI ethics, which is like, well, that's a risk that has never actually happened, and there is no actual evidence for it happening. And why don't we first focus on ethical issues and harms that are happening right now, such as bias, which a few of you have mentioned, and the environmental impact of large AI systems, and privacy issues, and all these other issues that are actually happening right now, and there is evidence that they're harming people right now. And so one of these schools of thought is based on the facts of what's happening, and the other is based completely on science fiction. There's no other place that they're getting their ideas. And so this is something, especially in the last few years, that I've really been thinking about a lot as a science fiction author who, started out writing about AI and started out writing it, in the way Halford describes as just an allegory for something else. And the more that I see, the news about AI and how things are progressing in the industry, the more I've started to think, what's my responsibility actually as a science fiction author to actually, if people are taking what they see in science fiction and just trying to directly apply it to their business models without stopping and checking in reality on the way, then what is the responsibility of a science fiction author to produce stories that will actually tell us something useful about the AI challenges we actually face in the present, and about the human factors there, because all of the problems that are actually happening with bias or with environmental impact or with privacy or with all these other things, they're problems that they're either a result of humans acting either deliberately in a harmful way or just kind of callously, like they have this other goal and they don't really mind that there are these other harms on the way. And so something I've tried to do more and more just in my more recent books is to really emphasize that human element, like who is actually building these systems? What are they trying to do with them? And why are they trying to do it that way? What's in it for them? And just to refocus on the humans and not on something completely inhuman that comes out of nowhere, because AI does not come out of nowhere. It is built by humans.
Thank you so much. And I think the idea of responsibility as an author, as an artist, to sort of put things into the world is really interesting. And I don't think there's a lot of other sectors where you have to worry about people lifting things from your work and actually implementing them sort of verbatim in real life. But maybe that's a sort of good jumping off point for thinking a little bit about how maybe our contemporary moment is changing how science fiction is portraying AI. I think you've all touched a little bit on how sort of 20th century ideas of artificial intelligence have shaped contemporary technology. But do you see it happening the other way? Have things like machine learning, large language models, or generative AI began to shape how AI is being represented in contemporary fiction? Do you guys think that the emergence of those technologies will shape in sort of the ways Ada described how authors or filmmakers are thinking about how they represent those technologies in the next 5 or 10 years? I'm happy to let Ada keep talking about that, but was wondering if anyone else wanted to jump in with a reflection there. Great. Ada, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, science fiction authors are people who live in the world, and so they're responding to what they see in the world around them. And so I think absolutely, as this goes on, we'll see more people writing fiction or creating television and film that does reflect what we're seeing in the AI world today. And it's just a question of how long that takes, kind of, because there is obviously a long lead time between having an idea and going through all the steps of making it into a published work. So we don't necessarily see that immediately always, but we will start to see it in the next couple of years. One example that I really enjoy just from this year is S.F. Huang's short story, Murder by Pixel, which is all about kind of, it's just a very, very, sorry, I'm forgetting what I was gonna say. But a very grounded story about some of the patterns of behavior and interaction that we're seeing on social media right now. And so people, there absolutely are people who, not just that one, who are writing about what they see on the internet or in the tech industry at this very moment. And it's just a question of how long that takes to kind of permeate culture sufficiently that it's in our popular movies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the sort of the long trajectory of that as people have those ideas and it works through the sort of publishing or production process. Um, I'd like to maybe pick up on something that both CJ and Halvard mentioned a moment ago, when sort of thinking about what kinds of allegories AI might be functioning at, and particularly that question of labor and gender, and maybe where those things intersect, sort of how we see AI technologies perhaps reflecting or in conversation with ideas of labor and gender as they're reflected in science fiction. I mean, the first thing that jumps to my mind is Siri and the sort of perpetuation of virtual AI assistants as this kind of feminized role. But was wondering if you all see other examples of that, or maybe perhaps different ways that gender and labor are intersecting, and whether they're drawing on what you see happening in science fiction. Maybe CJ, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think that the because I used to use the case of the shell to my classroom, and when I teach the students how to recognize a cyborg, and because they all look like, especially the character of such kind of dramatic, film, the heroine is always the human-like machine. They always have, they have the struggle with themselves about what if their machine are human. But the key point is they all look like human, and also at the end, of course, is the human aspect of win, and to finally, prove they're more like a human, not a machine. But my point is not just like scientific, fiction, the science fiction. It's more about why we have to imagine the AI has to be human-like. Because I'm dealing with algorithm like a cycle game. When we are use a cycle game to train the data model, and we always trying to find out what's more similar to the image we can recognize. I mean, the human can recognize. It's the same thing for the LLM. When I use a large model to train like a stable diffusion to produce images, we all pick out select the image we think beautiful or we think meaningful to human as a sample. So we dismissed a lot of fake or problems having the images having problem because we cannot recognize them or we don't understand them. But that's a machine thinking. And also, if we train in another way, like it's not just a bias for human, like we use gender, the single gender images for the data set. It's also we have the bias for machine, bias on human machine. Like we always pick the things we think it's useful for human being, but we never thought about maybe that's the way machine think about themselves. But that we don't know that. It's also already beyond our knowledge, or and what we can do. So for that part, I don't know the answer. But more and more we realize, maybe we already missed a lot of things during that process, during this training process, because all the works are only based on the label human, recognition abilities. So it's. But we don't know another part, like we also don't know what exactly machine thinks. It's more like, it's not really like an answer, it's more like a question because I'm still thinking about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Halvard, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so this thing about AI doesn't necessarily have to be like humans. I mean, I agree, and a lot of AI systems, which I mean, they would probably call them narrow AI systems. They do human tasks, but they don't do them in a human way. So all the all the successful game playing AIs, for example, one of the big things about AlphaGo was how it played Go very successfully, but in a completely inhuman way. It played Go in a way that no human actually would do, but it was much better at it. So I guess that points out perhaps a limitation in the way humans approach a game that they've created themselves, perhaps. But on the other hand, I also think that some of the things that we do with AI that we find most impressive is the AIs that do human-like things. So like you mentioned, Stable Diffusion, the fact that Stable Diffusion is capable of generating these fantastic images is very impressive to us, but it also reflects that it's doing something that humans are already capable of doing in some way. And, you know, things like LLMs, like ChatGPT, is impressive because it is human-like, and it's also human-like because it's building an understanding of human language. It might not do it in the way that humans do because there's way more data going into GPT-4 than any human could ever kind of process, but it's still doing that in a way to be able to create human language. So I mean, there is something about AIs don't have to be human-like, but then we kind of stop thinking of them as particularly impressive somehow, and they just become mechanical things. Like a calculator is much better at doing arithmetic than I am, but I don't think of it as a particularly impressive or intelligent system because it does a mechanical operation essentially. But when it comes to ChatGPT, it seems astonishing what it can do often, and you know it has its limitations as well. So, but I think it's very difficult to think about it in terms of what it can or cannot be, in terms of being like a human or being like something else, like an alien intelligence sort of. But ultimately, this also feeds into one of the big things about existential risk, which is about AI is setting their own goals that are orthogonal to human goals. And I always find that argument so weird because it's not like humans have, as a collective, have a goal. What's our goal? I don't know. But the AI has a goal that's orthogonal to something we're not even aware of, apparently. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and kind of draw together a couple of things I've been thinking about as I've been hearing the last few speakers. It's so interesting because I think that this issue about AI and specificity and like, you know, what Halvard's just said about how, oh yeah, if we start to think about it, it's actually not that interesting what it's doing. I think that this is an issue of narrative and discourse as well. One of the things that had a big impact on me and how I think about artificial intelligence, whatever we mean by that, there's this book, 10 Reasons for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts. And I'm going to butcher the guy's name. I cannot pronounce it, but I think it's something like Jaron Lanier. And he is somebody who's worked in virtual reality. He would be associated with cyberpunk. He'd be associated with things like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and things like that. So trying to fight for like a kind of common space of the internet. And one of the things he says in the Reasons for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts, you know, he's talking about black box algorithms that kind of generate social media feeds and how they're quite stupid. And actually they're easier to design than something that would actually make your social media experience interesting and expose you to the ideas that you actually like. So he's talking about artificial intelligence, and he points out that basically it was just like marketing bullshit by tech companies that they wanted to get investors on board. So they call something artificial intelligence when in actual fact, like, it's just a computer code that, again, like, you know, feeds off its own algorithms or whatever else. It's not actually something that's like transcendental. It's not, you know, some kind of sudden like ensouled consciousness. So I think that that's something, you know, because a lot of the times in conversations we'll be like acting as if like science fiction is like commentating on the reality, and here artificial intelligence itself is a kind of discourse, a narrative, and it's quite full of bullshit a lot of the time. So I think that recognizing that it's not like, you know, oh yes, smart artificial intelligence exists and science fiction's commentating on it in a kind of speculative way. Actually, artificial intelligence is always a descriptor that's quite it's narrative, it's constructed, blah blah blah. It's something to keep in mind. And I think this then impacts the issue of existential risk that we've discussed a little bit, that, you know, when we think about AI existential risk, it is often that kind of thing of you know, this thought experiment of, oh, a computer, make the maximum number of paper clips so it turns the whole globe into paper clips, killing all humans. That, like, these kind of thought experiments, like, they're quite, again, fantastic and spectacular, but really, like, existential risk can be so much more banal than that. And I think this is something that speaks to what CJ's saying about the figure of the cyborg. Like, we're already cyborgs, we're already kind of interdependent with our technology and affected by it. Like, I would ask people to think about how engaging with computers, whether you want to call it artificial intelligence, or whether you just are like, you know, your social media accounts, or just Google searching, how that shapes the brain pathways that you use most. We already translate our thoughts into something the computer can understand. When we think about, like, what keywords we can use to search for something, when we kind of make a subconscious decision to forget something because I know where to find that online, so I'm going to use that later. So we're already making these decisions and shaping our pathways in response to the computer. So to me, like, that in itself isn't necessarily an existential risk, it's just an acknowledgement of interdependence. The thing that I would see it with is something like a large language model, that if we are outsourcing the development of writing, then that is almost outsourcing the development of critical thinking, because writing is just basically a way for us to construct more complex thoughts. So that's something that, if I were to be concerned about an existential risk, that's the kind of thing that I would be going down. It doesn't have to be that AI is a spectacular consciousness that's self-directed. It's just something that we have to interact with that makes our thinking more banal and less interesting. So yeah, that's just some thoughts based on what people have been saying the last few minutes.
I just want to speak to that, actually, because I see your point about the dangers of outsourcing critical thinking to something like ChatGPT. Of course, ChatGPT isn't very good at producing that kind of writing, is it?
I haven't experimented too much with complex stuff on ChatGPT. I'd just be like, ChatGPT, be my agony aunt. And it's really good at being like, here's how you should deal with this life situation. So I haven't been like, can you please write me an academic
article? That's the thing, like, it excels at simple writing, but complex writing, it's really terrible at. But moreover, I think, I mean, we look at writing from perspective of people who do writing as a very complex and involving activity. But a lot of the writing that actually happens in the world is super boring, you know, super kind of objective in some sense. You know, it's writing a report. And if you can have an assistant that helps you with that to overcome, and this speaks to the labor aspect, but I think it speaks to some types of cognitive labor, like knowledge work, is actually not very fun to do. One of the projects I've been doing myself is trying to create a large language model that can do narrative analysis, because coming from a kind of literature background, I was always interested in narrative theory, but really only from the theoretical point of view, because actually doing narrative analysis is, while it requires a higher level of kind of capacity to do it, it's really dull to do it. So if I could automate that process, it'd be great. So I've been trying to do that. It's actually quite difficult because I don't think the models are quite there yet. But you know, my point being, a lot of the difficult cognitive work we do isn't actually that fulfilling, in the sense that critical writing can be.
Well, it's interesting you already say, like, oh yeah, some of this writing that's trying to be super objective and it's the boring writing, because then, like, you know, we're talking about how, like, these biases come into AI and things like that. So yeah, it's just that, like, that's just the concern that I would have, is like things being unexamined leads to difficult things being reproduced. But yeah, I totally take your point that are, like, arguably places for it. And if it actually led to, like, a reduction in the working week, you know, I would be interested in that. It's just like, that's not visibly happened so far, as I can tell.
I think the where ChatGPT is used the most is actually in, like, programming tasks. I see coders, they just use it all the time. I use it in coding myself. Yeah.
And do they get a 3 or 4 working week as a result, or do they just have to do more boring work?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It probably just leads to having to do more work. It's that's another question.
I think, Anna, your point about sort of potentially leading to reduced work leads me maybe into my final question before we open it up into Q&A, which is just as you guys reflect on that sort of back and forth relationship between technology and science fiction, as both are shaped in conversation with each other, it seems pretty evident that existential risk is one of the big areas where our sort of ideas about AI and science fiction are shaping discourse in the sort of technological space. Do you see sort of any other relationships that you find interesting or that you've been paying attention to where sort of ideas in science fiction or technology are moving back and forth and shaping each other in sort of interesting ways? Or is existential risk sort of this big overriding discourse and everything else has kind of been pushed away by it?
If I can speak to that. So existential risk seems to have like grown into this very massively public idea, and it starts out in these relatively obscure transhumanist forums in the late 90s, and it was back then it was explicitly about people being worried about AI, and at the time AI it was it was expert systems. It was quite limited in scope. They couldn't do really much outside of what they were explicitly designed to do. And so the ideas of this kind of superhuman agents, agential kind of amorphous thing that could suddenly take over the world was completely, entirely fictional. And so it's kind of weird that it's come from that space and just launched into discussions of government policy, like at the Bletchley Park summit just a few weeks ago. Existential risk, the real risk is what the governments do rather than what the AIs do ultimately. And we see that very clearly in several conflicts across the world, that governments are the real existential risk for quite a large amount of people.
Does anyone else have a reflection they'd want to offer?
Yeah, I want to add something to the Ada talked earlier about the responsibilities, because now I think people just put too much hope on the companies, the big companies, hope them can do something to be responsible for the future of the AI. I think that's kind of ridiculous, because they're a company, they're making profits. So even when we are thinking about the future of the AI, even the governments or the university or research institutes have done a lot of things or haven't done enough. But still, we need something that kind of a third part people or community to do something, to not really control, but at least we need to watch on what's going on. And the company really has done little. Yeah, that's the first reflection. The second one is about actually because AI and the large model things requires the high information curation abilities, which is really short among the young generation. That's something we are worried about very much. We encourage students to try the ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion to do such kind of assistant work or to save labor or time. But at the same time, we have to warn them, to let them realize they have to have the ability to use them. That's really important because they don't know how to use them properly. And even we gave them the guidelines, but the problem is they have been lost in the internet for a long time. So even for the information curation abilities, long back to the Web 1, first generation of the websites, they since then they haven't done enough to improve their ability. Now we have this kind of open AI age. So for the young generation, that is my concern. Probably we have to do something to help them to know what's the facts, in the AI age. Just the two short reflections.
Thank you. And Anna, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of things there, I suppose. Like one of the things, like we could talk about existential risk as like a literal thing, like, a computer destroys the world, sets up nuclear bombs, whatever. A lot of the time science fiction is also concerned with how interaction with computers might lead to a loss of individual agency. And I suppose that's kind of more what I was talking about in terms of like taking our critical thinking and outsourcing it to a computer potentially. And I can see that the trends that I see at the moment, if you could call it as such, like I was thinking when you were talking there, Michael, about there's a novel called The This by Adam Roberts, who's one of my favorite science fiction authors. And he basically uses Twitter as a way to think about a kind of hive mind scenario. So again, thinking about that loss of agency, people just moving into a collective. And his novel's really interesting because it's kind of dealing with that. It's dealing with the issue of, obviously, you don't want someone else to be controlling you, but equally there's comfort to be found in community and connection. So I think that's something that science fiction might deal with a bit more, thinking about that balance between control and community. That's something that I think it might explore a bit more. And then the second thing that kind of speaks more to what CJ was just talking about there in terms of like thinking about corporations and that kind of thing. This is something that occurred to me earlier when we were talking about gender, that there is a whole line of thinking about gender and AI, the woman as a kind of servant, Siri and Alexa, and having female names and voices a lot of the time, and the issues that has. But I think thinking about masculinity here as well, thinking about these kind of tech bros or the leaders of these organizations that seem to be so important and are nearly always men. I think that's a good way to think about how gender plays into this. Obviously, Ex Machina by Alex Garland, to my mind, one of the best films about AI as well, really leans into that with this portrayal of this tech bro. The masculinity here is just as important as the femininity. And I think that's something we've maybe seen with Sam Altman and the OpenAI issue over the weekend, that for some reason this figurehead is more important than the actual technology that's being produced. And there's a sense of like needing like a strong man to lead this technology and to promote it to people. So so I think like making sure that masculinity is visible in this conversation and not just like a default and we're just thinking about feminine gender, I think is maybe worth thinking about too.
Just wanted to comment on the Ex Machina, which is a great film, but I do wonder if it's actually about AI. Because it's very overtly retelling of the Bluebeard's Castle fairy tale, but in this kind of contemporary, slightly futuristic technological idiom. So, is it really about AI? Or is it, like you say, about these kind of gender relationships and the tech bros in a contemporary moment, that kind of thing? But yeah,
it's really interesting, however, to try and like think about science fiction is allegorical, but also like we do tend to take it literally when it suits us as science fiction critics. So I don't know. I think we could move between the two, but it's definitely an interesting question about when is it appropriate to think of the allegory as opposed to the literal depiction of the tech that's in front of us.
Yeah, thanks all. And Ada, I just want to make sure you have a chance to jump in if you'd like to before we open up to questions from the audience.
Well, on the topic that we were talking about a few minutes ago, on the topic of AI not having to be human-like, one of my areas of study is computer-generated poetry. And this is something people have actually been using computers to generate poetry since the 1950s. It's something that actually has a longer history than people might know about. And for a long time, the reason anyone would play with that or would try having a computer-generated poetry was specifically because the computer was not like a human. And it would produce these turns of phrase or these juxtapositions that were either very, very self-consciously artificial or that were just such non sequiturs that they were startling and that they had an interesting effect. And either way, The effect came from the fact that the computer was processing language in a very non-human way, in a very arbitrary way, and not necessarily even in a AI way specifically, because you can do this with very simple algorithms like a Markov model, or with just like picking words randomly. And when large language models were developed, this really, really changed the entire way that people thought about computers and poetry. So all of a sudden you have something like ChatGPT, which can, I mean, you tell it, ChatGPT, please write me a poem, and it'll write you a little poem. And but because of the way ChatGPT is trained, it has all of this human text to draw on, and it can produce very coherent, very easy to understand poems. But they're also, the way it uses language, because it's optimized to predict the most likely completion of a phrase, and because it's so good at that, it produces this very, very average, very, very banal kind of way of writing, which is completely the opposite of what computer generated poetry was always like before that. And it's really interesting to me that I mean, obviously the style of language is not the only factor. The great commercial success of the program is definitely another factor, but it's only at this point where computer generated text started to be more human-like and more kind of average and banal human-like, and trying to be an imitation of humans instead of doing its own thing. It's only at this point that authors and artists who were not closely involved with AI before started to look at it and to say, "Oh, hang on a second, this thing is a threat to us, and it's bad." And it's only at that point where it started to imitate humans that it started to produce that effect.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to think about how in some ways, it's getting better at mimicking human language, and in fact, that makes it potentially less useful or less interesting in those contexts. So I want to thank you all for those thoughts, and we'll open it up now to some Q&A from our audience. And I think that thought actually leads really nicely into a question here from Maddie, which is, have you come across very untypical portrayals of AI in fiction, non-human, maybe non-alive, non-perspectival? Are there any sort of versions of AI in sci-fi that you all think about when you think of something that's interesting, provocative, not like the normal way it shows up? And I know that's a hard question to sort of drench through all the science fiction you've ever come across.
I think I actually spoke a little bit to that, and that's about this using AI as a personified system that becomes a very non-human thing. But obviously, it uses AI as a kind of interface between the system and our understanding of it. So there is, I guess the rhetorical term would be the prosopopoeia, which is speaking to the mask. So the AI is a mask over the system that speaks to you. And I actually saw an argument from this American digital humanist called Ben Schmidt, and he argued that ChatGPT is actually this sort of prosopopoeia, where our experience of the chat interface is that kind of mask that lies on top of the language model underneath. So the chat mediates the output of the language model in order to be a very specific type of interaction. And if you've spoken to ChatGPT, you know that particular personification is kind of sniveling and sycophantic and always saying sorry. A bit annoying, actually. But my point being, there are these kind of inhuman depictions, but often the in fiction, the AI becomes this mediating layer between the system and our understanding of it. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that AI is used as a way of narrative experimentation, So my main kind of point of reference here is this series of books by Anne Leckie called Ancillary Justice, or the Empire Ranch series, something like that. Basically, it's a very human personified AI, seemingly, but it's also kind of, it can live 1,000 years, and it's actually distributed across both kind of spaceships and several instantiations of the same person. So it becomes this ability to experiment wildly with narrative devices while still seeming like a conventionally narrated novel. I think it's very cleverly done, actually.
Yeah, I think that series is one of my favorite examples of sort of really pushing at the idea of how we could think about AI in a way that doesn't really map onto any of our contemporary technologies. Does anyone else have an example that jumps to mind?
Yeah, just thinking about that, the networked aspect of AI, I think, is something that's really interesting as well, and the way that sometimes these systems can be interlocking. So I would maybe recommend Joanna Kavena's novel Z, which is basically a novel of the algorithm, and shows you how all these different kind of artificial intelligence systems can be kind of organizing different aspects of public life, and that can lead to unintended consequences. So you know, there's lots of bits of this that are really funny. Like, one of the CEOs decides that he doesn't want people swearing and being aggressive to each other, so everyone's speech gets automatically changed into something really polite, even when they're obviously cursing each other out. It's getting automatically generated. And it's really funny, but like, it also ends up being this kind of Kafkaesque nightmare that people get stuck in these kind of computer says no cul-de-sacs and find it really hard to navigate their way out of it as well. So that's a kind of warning that comes from these more distributed AIs and different systems working together or against each other.
Well, we've got another question here from Jen, which is about sort of what areas of AI you think should be prioritized for further inquiry. And I know that no one here is either like a tech CEO nor a policymaker. So maybe expanding that question out just a little bit, when you think about the issues you're interested in, whether that's contemporary technology or the sort of science fiction end of things, what would you love to see more people sort of experimenting with or playing around with? Is there a topic that you think is really interested that's underexplored, either in the sort of area of science fiction you study, or maybe even in the sort of contemporary technological landscape? I'm sorry, I know we're just throwing like really big questions at you sort of right out the gate. So feel free to sort of pick up any piece of that.
So I think I mentioned that I've been working on basically fine-tuning a large language model to perform narrative analysis, and I think this that kind of task is very interesting to, you know, the academics among us. Not just narrative analysis, but any kind of humanities or even social science type of qualitative research and methodology. There is potential for actually using existing AI tools and so-called fine-tuning them to perform these tasks, but it's not very sellable. And I think that's the problem with when you're thinking about AI in the contemporary kind of ecosystem and what's available. It's nearly always with a mind towards how can you sell this? And you know, as academics, we don't produce things that you can sell very much, but they can be very useful. And I think, because I just did a master's in data science, and they're talking about humanities questions all the time, but they don't really have any idea about how they work. So they're trying to figure it out without knowing anything about it. It's kind of odd.
Yeah, and Ada, I know you're. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, CJ.
No, it's okay. Right? Just yeah, to this question you mentioned. So because I was thinking about the labor work things, that's you know, I'm from China, and we also have a lot of kinds of artificial intelligence labor factories to produce annotation the text for the artificial intelligence training. But we have to think about so to me, I think a priority for the AI is about data. Firstly, because we collected data from all different worlds, parts of the world, but the problem is we don't share it to all of the people. And also we gave up our rights to the data authorities. And also, but on the other hand, really there are lots of people are making money. I mean the normal people, like women from the low outcome, families, actually they are making lives for working for the data companies. So it seems like we still have a lot of issues related to the data, not really the high technology AI. It's just like the lowest level, we still have a lot of problems. And that's a kind of infrastructure for us to think about what is AI building on. And also that's kind of a question we are talking about the fancy AI. We normally forget, what's happening underground. So to me, that's a kind of very important question. Sorry, I interrupt you. Yeah.
No worries at all. I think that's a really important reminder to sort of think about the data underlying these systems and the people involved with that. I think also sort of leads into the question I wanted to ask Ada, which is, as someone who teaches computer scientists and who also has this life that's like deeply embedded in these kind of humanistic science fiction worlds, how do you see your students grappling with these issues? What are the questions it seems like they might be asking, and how do you try to sort of bring those two worlds into conversation in your work?
That's a really good question. I actually feel like my students, I mean, I teach first-year students. I teach first-year undergrads. And so a lot of the time, the questions they're asking are just these very basic questions that we see in the media, like, could a large language model be sentient? And of course it couldn't, but I have to explain to them why it couldn't. And I actually really, CJ, you apologized for interrupting, but I actually really appreciate what you said about actually looking at what's on the ground, because that was going to be my answer to the previous question. Because large language models in particular, they're so relatively new and so powerful in certain ways, but also so limited in others. And there is all sorts of, I think, utopian speculation about, what these computers could do for us, but also a lot of dystopian speculation, like, oh, they're going to, even aside from existential risk, like, oh, they're going to destroy all our jobs. And it's very difficult to actually predict between those two extremes what's actually going to happen on the ground, what are actually going to be the social effects of having these systems, how are they going to affect the way we think about language and about reading and writing and learning. And we don't know the answers to those questions. We're not going to know them until we've been able to empirically study them. And so I think, I guess what I want to see just in the near future is just more concrete study of what effects these systems are actually having.
Yeah, Howard.
Sorry, I can't shut up. I love talking about this. Yeah, I think it's really interesting about what you're saying about the actual effects of this having, because from one perspective, in the kind of the imaginary of AI, it's all about control, because in reality, we can't predict anything. And there's so much about trying to predict what's going to happen. And the fantasy of AI is that it will be able to both predict and control outcomes in a very definite manner. And then you take that, you extrapolate kind of that line of thought, and suddenly we're living in a simulated reality, right? Because if you can predict, that means you can simulate what's happening. And if you can simulate everything that's happening, that means everything can be simulated. And if that's possible, then suddenly it becomes probable that everybody's living in a simulation. There's this line of argument that takes place here. The simulation argument is one. The paperclip maximizer that Anna mentioned is another. it's, you know, it's the argumentum ad absurdum, but it's taken literally. It's taken at face value that, you know, oh, if this is possible, then it's probable. There's a disconnect there, I find, in the whole thing. So I agree, we should study possible outcomes, but it's so hard to actually figure out what possible outcomes are. And that's the reality of any new technology. It has very, very unintended consequences, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if there's sort of one consistency both across the sort of science fiction and real life implications, is such the unintended consequences that are really the ones we need to think about, and it's challenging to do that because they are unintended by their very nature. I am conscious that this isn't a sort of a digital humanities seminar, and so maybe we'll turn to one of the questions that's a bit more sort of academically focused, which is from Rebecca about the way we cite generative AI. I was wondering if you all have any reflections on particularly the example Rebecca gives is that APA style now says to cite the algorithm creator, OpenAI in the case of ChatGPT, but that earlier version said to cite the chatbot, so citing ChatGPT. And I was wondering if you all have any reflections or how you see that shaping up in sort of your areas of scholarly practice.
This is a first like knee-jerk reaction. Like, I think that's quite funny, because earlier on saying cite the chatbot, it kind of does, because like I say, I've had just like I dabbled with using ChatGPT, but just in like GPT, but just in a kind of casual way. So it does feel like friendly, and you do want to personify it, and then to like cite it as ChatGPT is kind of to say like this is a person and I'm citing their work. So I think that this move to citing the creator, OpenAI, is probably a good move. Like when people will correct you when you use he or she to describe an artificial intelligence, no, you should say it. I think that these things are probably quite important for reminding us that this isn't actually a person. So that's just my knee-jerk response. And maybe more broadly in terms of how these AIs are functioning in academia so far, as I suppose one of the things that I thought I might just throw in is that I haven't seen much evidence of students using this so far in assessments, and it was something that I was really worried about, and something that there's been a lot of discussion about in academic circles about, can we use the essay as a form of assessment anymore if these things can just be generated. So like Halvard's saying, the large language models aren't necessarily good at complex writing, but if the student isn't very good, they might not realize that before they submit it. They might think, yeah, that looks fine. It's got like, you know, all of the kind of things that I see when I see academic writing, so therefore it must be fine, I'll submit it. But luckily that's not been my experience. I know other academics have had different experiences, but yeah, it's something that has been more on my mind about LLMs than much else, since, you know, working in academia, the essay is really important for us. So yeah, just something slightly tangential but possibly relevant.
To the question of citing, I think it becomes almost impossible to say, because the creator of the algorithm, how do you know? Like there's OpenAI has what, 750 employees. I don't know if all of them are involved in the creation of the chatbot. I know the model is created by somebody else, but that's not the chatbot. The chatbot, I don't think, has any kind of official people credited as the implementers of that. So if you're going to cite the creators of the algorithm, I don't think that gives full credit. If you only cite ChatGPT, then, you know, that gives only credit to the algorithm itself, which in a way, you know, it's what's creating it. And also it's building on you know, most of the published text on the World Wide Web. So in some way where it's a statistical consequence of all the words, so to speak. And, you know, you have to give it a prompt. So in some sense, you actually are part of that creation yourself.
One of the reasons why this is really a really interesting question is because it also ties into the question of copyright. You know, for authors and also for people studying AI writing, in order for something to be copyrighted, you have to have an author. And so this is something that's being debated back and forth quite a lot, is to what extent can you have a computer program be an author in a legal sense, or to what extent can a human be considered an author in a legal sense if part of their writing is being done by a computer. And one of the ideas that's come about around this is the idea of distributed authorship, which is that, well, you know, this was written, part of the responsibility for writing this was with this human, and part of it was with this computer, and part of it was the people who made the computer, part of it was the people who trained, you know, who created the training data. But legally speaking, we don't really have a system that can account for that kind of distributed authorship and distributed contribution. And especially, we don't have a system where, for a commercial use of writing, where all those distributed authors can be compensated fairly.
Yeah, I'm also I'm still struggling with students, even sometimes my colleagues, with them about how to cite a Wikipedia page correctly. Because for a lot of them, they cannot, especially for students, they cannot recognize what's the differences between the web page knowledge and a book knowledge, right? And because we know Wikipedia is good enough, even sometimes it's more accurate than the dictionary. But to the students, they have to learn how to evaluate the value of the citation, the resources. But the problem is, for the OpenAI or ChatGPT softwares, the problem is you cannot prove them by themselves. So the students, it's hard for them, or even very difficult for them, to verify the results by themselves. And also, we cannot do that either. So which means I cannot evaluate the student's contribution or that ChatGPT's contribution in their essays. So like Harvard mentioned about prompt engineer work, now we have to ask the students to provide a detail about the process, like screenshots, for them to prove actually they are using them, but they only using in the several ways. So but I don't see the better way to really to use them to evaluate the contribution. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. That feels like a sort of nice place to end it. I know we didn't get a chance to get through everyone's questions, but it feels like we're able to touch on a number of really important issues. So I think all that remains is for me to take a moment to thank all of our panelists today. I really appreciate you all taking the time to be with us, share your expertise and your thoughts on this topic. And normally we do a round of applause, but I think everyone could just give virtual applause to thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And I will also just invite everyone to join us for our next seminar, which is going to take place on Thursday, December 7th at 12 p.m. London time, which will be picking up on some of the themes from today's conversation and looking a little bit more deeply at the branding, memes, and narrative around AI, particularly how that shows up both online and in corporate context today. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you everyone for coming today.